brought to you by MuleSoft, provider of the industry-leading Anypoint platform for APIs.
I'm going to try and give this a go. Hi, I'm Mark Boyd from ProgrammableWeb. But if the noise if my throat's not annoying you, by all means, leave now and go and check out one of the other two presentations, or you're welcome to leave at any time. I'm going to try and do it in about 20 minutes as well, so we'll go through a bit faster. I'm really sorry about this, but I still wanted to give you a chance. But it's all about user experience, so if your experience isn't that great, you're welcome to leave at any time. I've been working at ProgrammableWeb for about a year and a half now, writing about APIs. And these are what I've been doing over the recent months is been looking at a selection of API business models and trying to figure out what are some of the key metrics for each of them, and then where is it that these APIs are really building a developer ecosystem and getting revenue base for those developers. So I'm presuming a lot of you are developers in this room? Yep, okay, cool. So I guess for you guys, it's about if you're looking to build a product with someone else's APIs, then how are you going to choose which APIs might be good for your revenue generating in the longer term? Okay, so it's like, what's the secret sauce behind? Here's Fyndiq, which is a Swedish e-commerce retailer, and as you can see, they introduced their API around April in 2011, and then 2 months later, it started to shoot up. Oh, actually, is that right? I've going for me. Yeah, April, and then April by August, they started to see the J-curve. WePay is a platform payments API. They pivoted at the start of this year. They used to have a product SaaS sort of option as well. Because they saw the API opportunities, they've pivoted, so they're just an API as a product now. And then you can see they revamped their developer pages in about March to match that pivot. And then they're starting to see this J-curve. This is in website unique visits, but it's all developers looking at their websites. And then it's TransportAPI. Harry Wood's presenting somewhere else today, I think, a bit later in the day, I think, or maybe a bit earlier. I've forgotten the schedule. But here you can see also that in 3 years they've been going small developer numbers, and then this year will ramp up. And finally, Walgreens, a photo printing service API. So Walgreens, a big retail customer chain in the US. They found that the people who, because of their API, what was happening is they were building apps and building, developers were building apps and building other interfaces in which people could access Walgreens. When Walgreens customers were using the internet, apps, and going into the store, those customers were spending 6 times more than those who just came into the store. And through revamping their photo printing service so that it was available as an API, and therefore image applications could automatically add the API in, so that if you had like an Instagram type photo editing service, you could automatically send printed photos from your app to Walgreens for collection. And there was a revenue sharing model with the developers who integrated the API in that way. And now Walgreens see 40% of their photo printing services coming from that API channel. So what I did is I looked at all of these ones. Now I'm going to go back after hearing Noam's talk today and add SimilarWeb and try to do the numbers on that as well. Really fascinating presentation, and I'll be looking forward to writing that up. Unfortunately, it's taken a lot of the wind out of my sails because he's solved a lot of the problems I'm going to be talking about today. First of all, what we did with this research is we did a business model canvas mapping. So are many of you familiar with the business model canvas? It's like, yeah, great. Of course, it's pretty cool. So it's Osterwald has designed this system of looking at all of the key inputs and outputs for a business model, and then being able to identify, how that business works. So we mapped this for each of those businesses here. And just their API. So, for example, Walgreens also has a prescription refill API. We didn't bother looking at that for this study. We just looked at the photo printing one. Same with the Sears. And then we plugged it into launch.io, and thanks Holger. Holger's in the front doing a wave. So Holger's got a bit of a passion for the business model canvas approach, and what he's done is he's designed a interface where you can automatically plug it in, and we're doing that at the moment, and we're using also this is going to be our research tool for some of the follow-up conversations, because there's screens where you can add conversations with stakeholders and all the rest. I invite you to check out launchd.io. LaunchD, that's right. I always say launch.io and I always get in trouble for it. It's launchd. Okay, and then what we did was, for each of those business models, we looked at the API business model. So are you familiar with this from John Musser? So there's the reference at the bottom, but if you go John Musser business models slide share into Google, it'll come up with the link. And you can see he's identified 20 different business revenue models that come out of different API businesses. And so we've tracked and identified which ones of those. Also, what we're trying to do at ProgrammableWeb is on the ProgrammableWeb database page, there's a list of each API and details about the API. We're considering adding the business model type to that database as well. Then we looked at the desktop research. To me, this is really important, because this is what started it in one way. Was in my interviews with different API providers on ProgrammableWeb, no one wants to give me exact numbers on things. So I'll ask how many developers are in your network, and it's like, I don't really want to share that. Like no one wants to talk about that stuff. And when you hear about it, or maybe this was my impression, but I think it's a fairly common impression, we're thinking in the thousands. Like there's thousands of developers connected to each API or looking at each API, or that's sort of like a cultural norm that we're accepting as the values. And then the closest I got was some people were willing to talk about growth rates in their developer numbers over time. Walgreens, for example, they were talking about 3 times growth rate for their developer audience over the last year and a half. What we did for this research is we went back, we just did desktop stuff. We looked at how many developers were active on each of the API businesses' forums. We then tallied up a list of all applications that they were saying were using their API, or all of their hackathons and the number of people they said were at their hackathons, and we listed it from all of their blog posts. We looked at any marketplace listings of the apps that are built with those APIs and identified those. We looked at Twitter and Facebook numbers. They're not that useful. I think because even if you're not building with the API, or if you're a friend of a friend, or you just like some quote or something that they've posted, you might end up liking them. So it's not a really great indicator of actual developer numbers, but it gives you an idea. Twitter and Facebook. For YouTube, it's a bit better, because you can look at actual number of views, and then it comes right down. Then it's like 20 views for a tutorial or something like that. So then you're getting more into it. And also I looked at GitHub followers and saw how many people were following them on GitHub. For the most part, any guesses how many would be on average? I just want to guess. Who reckons above 500 on average? Yeah. Who guesses above 250? Yeah, a couple. Who guesses lower than 100? Yeah, it's about lower than 100 for most. I'll show you some of that. Okay, then we looked at some other indicators. So current positions vacant for API developer team. That's something we're going to be looking at. I want to look at more as a longitudinal thing. So it's looking at things like, I'm going to get through this real quick actually. We're going to look at the number of, because that's a sort of sign of growth in the future. When venture capitalists are looking at where to invest, one of the things they look at is rate of growth of the team and rate of growth of the square footage of the office space. So we're trying to mimic some of that as well. We've been getting developer feedback on time to hello world. That varies per API, but it's important to identify. It's a key metric as far as how easy it is for an API provider to use. the API developer to use the API. And then we've got some revenue data around the APIs that are being consumed, like so the developers that are using, consuming an API and how much they're making from it. The majority of that I can get from App Annie stats, and it's for more of the bigger players like Evernote, for example. But there are a few other new data sources that are coming online, so I've been trying to look into those as well. And then we also go back and talk to each of the API providers and see what they're willing to share, which isn't that much, to be honest. But that's fair enough. A lot of this is competitive intelligence. What we're trying to do, though, is be able to quantify some of these things and give a bit more accurate picture for developers, because the end game for this sort of work is, like I was saying, is so if you're wanting to decide which APIs to use in order to have the most chance of success of building a revenue model out of it, then this hopefully will be useful research. So at the moment we're confirming all of the data that we've collected with each of those API providers. So in fairness to them, I won't be able to show you too much of the actual figures. But one of the key findings that we're getting to so far is, first of all, the developer numbers don't need to be huge. Number two, we're having a clear business model with the revenue sharing arrangements described are the better ones to go after, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And some of the best practices that you hear about here and at other conferences, they're not as widely implemented as you would think. So there might be some opportunities as far as building developer tools for those, it's not a crowded we all know, I guess, sometimes when you come to these sorts of conferences, it's easy to think some of it's been sewn up by people who've already gotten there first. In fact, it's still there's still a lot of opportunity in the API economy. So the developers don't need to be huge. Here's 3 APIs that we studied. The first one is, I can actually say it's Walgreens, and that's 125 developer teams using their photo printing service API. They've just announced that publicly, that they've been willing to share that. And so 125 developer teams are responsible for almost half of their revenue that's coming through for their photo printing service across 800 store locations in the US. So it's a great thing for API channels, or demonstrating the value of API revenue channel, and it's also showing that it's not necessarily about having thousands of developers all working on your API as well. The second one, this one is from their website. So they've said on their website 400. When I look at the numbers, I can't figure out how they get to 400, but maybe they've got partnerships that aren't on their GitHub listing and aren't in their developer forums and all the rest. So that one, I would still treat cautiously until we get some people back from it. And then the third one was like 56, and that was generous. I think it's a little bit of overcounting, because I was looking at 30 on some figures and 26 on another. So I was generous and put them together, I think, rather than seeing that there might be quite a bit of overlap in those. So they're all of those sorts of size. So again, I think for developers, it's not as daunting when you think, or even API providers, it's not as daunting when you think about huge numbers. Okay, the business models that most of these API providers seem to have, a lot of them were the developer pays model. Some are, their pay-as-you-go on API calls was quite popular. And then I should have put these 2 together. Then the freemium, so you get a certain number of calls that you're able to make and then be able to afford. And then there were some, mostly in the payment space, for example, that are a transaction fee. So once people start trading using your payment API, then they get a thin percentage on top of that. Where the worry I've got for the developer pays model is around Internet of Things. You see a lot of new businesses coming out with an Internet of Things focus, and they're going straight to a developer pays model, which I'm really anti, because it's trying to force all of the expenses onto the developer when the hardware is still trying to find a developer audience. So I think it would be much better to figure out some sort of revenue models where if you're going to be a platform in IoT, that the hardware people or the wearables tech or whatever has to pay to get access to your developer audience. But I'm yet to see anyone be thinking around that. Then there are some developer gets paid models, like Walgreens, for example, with a revenue share, and I think that's a really strong sign of success as well. Some people would say pay-as-you-go on API calls is a sort of revenue share model in itself, because people like TransportAPI, for example, you do your API calls, but anything you make on top of those API calls is part of your revenue sort of thing, and by leveraging their API, you're able to reach those audiences. So, there's some talk of that. But I would have expected the developer gets paid revenue share to be a bit more common than I've seen it. And one that I was surprised by, I really don't like this one, is the free for now and we'll see what happens. You see that with a lot of startups, and I guess maybe that's okay. I do believe in what John Musser talks about as far as you can't really start an API without knowing what business model you're going to go into, even if it changes over time, but you need to have, some definition of that to start with. But anyway, in one case I have seen where that's sort of been successful, where because the API provider has been bought by a larger entity, they can now leverage access to enterprise customers. So developers who come along, use that API, they can then become consultants for this larger enterprise customer base as well. So they haven't figured out their revenue sharing model, but it's still attracting developers because they want access to their enterprise customers. Does that make sense? Yeah, so in that case, they were like, we'll figure it out later when we see some of the, see what it looks like as far as what developers are getting back. But I think developers overall, developers are a bit more cautious of that, like Adam Devander talked about yesterday, is it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in developers using those APIs if there's not even a clear contract of agreement around, how we're going to split up money and all of the rest. So in the longer term, I think even intuitively developers just think tables might be turned on using that API, so look for other options. Okay, so it's interesting to note though, those that have a clear revenue model also seem to have a few other of these characteristics. First of all, they had an early adopter policy. Like when I say developer engagement, I said developer engagement a bit earlier around one of the benefits of those. I'm not talking about hackathons really. I mean, hackathons have their place. Yes, I think they're great for like a marketing thing, and they're really great for getting your API provider developer team to meet with developers and see what happens when those developers are using your API. So you can do some really interesting testing and all of that sort of stuff. For longer term opportunities as far as building viable businesses out of using your API, except in the very rare cases, I haven't seen API providers build strong developer relationships with any of their hackathon competitors. And also, to be honest, I've heard from some API providers and tech people, there is some, I don't know if the word's prejudice against hackathon competitors, but there is like sometimes a feeling that they're not the right developers we're looking for anyway. That's not across the board, but it is a comment that I've heard a few times over about, so I won't say any more about that. But instead, where I think you do see a really strong developer engagement policy is when developers are brought in very early on. So when there's a private beta of a product, for example, then the API provider is working with a set of real-life developers, early adopters, and getting them involved in from the get-go and listening to their feedback. That's a really strong sign. And you see that quite commonly with those who have a clear revenue sharing model with their API developers. One thing I've seen that's interesting, both in these cases and then also more widely amongst startups actually recently, is it's quicker to start splintering off developer engagement between who you think is going to be a commercial developer partner, and then who's going to be your sort of long-tail developers who are more interested in finding really innovative uses for your API. It was interesting, Noam sort of talked about this in his slide where he was showing that he'd done some he'd done some analytics on who was using his API, running it through Reportive, so he had their positions, identifying who the VP was, and starting to personalise communication to that VP. So I think that's what I mean about splintering. So very early on, you're seeing a lot of these actually start having a team specifically targeting those high potential commercial value. And I think because they've got a clear revenue model, they've got that mindset from the get-go that they're talking about commercial applications of their API. The really good ones, I think also though, they do have like a 20% split or something like that, 20-30% split, where they are interested in long-tail developers, the hobbyists who are creating something, because from there occasionally you get the really off-the-wall stuff that you would never thought possible with your API. So it's not about like shutting down or ignoring that, and the really good ones have a lot of respect for that proportion of their developer audience as well. Philips Hue, for example, they've got like about a 70-30 split. So 70% of their developer engagement is focused on commercial applications, and then 30% is trying to encourage developers to come up with crazy ways to use their sensor light bulb API systems. Then I also see the ones that are really creating developer ecosystems that have long-term viability for the developers getting involved, are those that have a showcase page or a marketplace page that's on their website or as part of their website. I would say this is fairly new, apart from someone like Evernote, who's been great at this sort of stuff. In a lot of cases, this is a fairly new practice. So again, we're only just starting to see it, but amongst those that we are seeing, the developers that are building on their API are getting more customers straight away. And that's because you've got a qualified lead audience. So again, I'll describe Philips Hue, I'll use them as an example. There's a few others in the research, but I'll confirm with them. So Philips Hue, for example, when they started adding applications that people had built with the Philips Hue API onto the Philips Hue app, for example, then people were buying more of those applications because they've already got the Philips Hue system, so they're qualified leads. And it's the same with their website. Once they had a showcase page on their website of look what you can do with Philips Hue, but because of apps that are built on our platform, again, it was a sort of faster ramp up for getting customers. So having some sort of looking at which API providers have good co-marketing or have a co-marketing ethic or a marketplace or showcase pages or other ways to really try to get your API, your application product built with their API in front of their audience. And it goes both ways. So I think sometimes API providers think that as an API developer consumer, you're creating a new revenue stream. But it's about this symbiotic thing where you're also being able to access some of their audience. And some of these API providers are now getting more of an idea of that, I think. Okay, the best practices that are on the to-do list, I was a bit surprised by this, and the first one was really surprising, although, like I say, Noam's taken the wind out of my sails a bit because he's proved that's not the case now. The developer market funnel analytics, like everyone talks about, developers aren't, you can't market to developers and all of the rest. But there is still a clear funnel, it's sort of like check out the website, register for an API key, play around with the API key, play around with the API maybe in a sandbox environment. Make your first API calls, then start generating an application that's going to be making all these API calls to it. So you could map that out and then look at, okay, out of the ones that are, out of your developers who are then either paying for your API if it's a freemium model or that you are starting to share revenue with, then what are their touch points? Which ones are their most, how How many API calls are they making? What resources are they drawing on from your website? Like, how long were they using your sandbox environment for? How many tutorial pages have they checked out, and what was their length of time on those tutorial pages? Where did they come from in the first place? Can you look at their original source, source entry point? All of those, are they more active on GitHub? Are they the ones active on GitHub, or are they the ones active in our forum? No one that I can find is really doing that. The leaders of the pack that I spoke to are starting to try to think of how to do this. Some of this is because it's, no one pointed out, it's not inbuilt into a lot of the API management provider features at the moment. I think I spoke to Apigee last week, and they're introducing it in theirs. And there are a couple of other API management providers who specialise in this, but for the most part, it's not an off-the-shelf product. So you have to do what Noam showed us how to do, and how to build that spreadsheet yourself. But I think that for smaller API providers, that will be really useful information, because that's actually going to be able to tell you where to invest more of your time. Adam Devander yesterday talked about one easy one is looking at programming languages. So if you're looking at what programming languages your developer audience is using, if you're an API provider, then maybe it's about making sure, and the answer is 50% use PHP, JavaScript is getting up there or whatever. So you might be wanting to build an SDK first for those, or have some website content tutorials that are relevant to them. But it differs in each case. Podio, for example, introduced a mobile SDK specifically because they noticed a lot of their end customers, not the developers, but their end customers were a growing proportion were accessing Podio's services via a mobile device, a tablet or a phone. So they opened a mobile SDK so that their developers could better reach their end customers, for example. But there's a whole heap of work that can be done there to show, for an API provider, where's your biggest wins if you're going to invest a little bit more money in developer engagement and developer adoption. I was really surprised that discoverability is really low as a, I don't know if it's low as a concern, but it's low as a strategy to deal with the concern. So maybe API providers are worried about how to get their API in front of audiences, but they don't know, but they're not using any of the things that are available. So there's limited use of description languages. So again, I was really surprised by this, because in these sorts of forums, you hear a lot about RAML and Swagger and API Blueprint. But the API providers I spoke to, when I was saying, so which do you use, Swagger or RAML or whatever, a lot of them were like, we're going to be looking into description languages. We might actually, start adding one to our APIs. So I was quite surprised by that, to be honest. The other one I was surprised by is there's really limited uses of SEO and PPC. Like Noam mentioned about with working with other marketplace providers, like Google Docs add-ons, the Salesforce marketplace, the App Exchange. Who was the App Exchange? That was Salesforce. Yeah, and then there was another one. Azure, for example. And one thing Noam mentioned earlier in the previous presentation was how it's a lot easier than trying to market your app, because people are doing it, but no one's really doing it well as far as speaking to the right contacts in those marketplaces to get your API featured on their marketplace. And I would say that's the same with SEO and PPC. Occasionally, as a writer with ProgrammableWeb, occasionally when I write about one API aggregator, for example, I might get an email from another API aggregator in that same field, and they might say, hey, I saw you had an article about them, can you write an article about me? That doesn't happen. I don't really like those emails, but that doesn't happen very often, though. It's not a very aggressive push for even online marketing, for content marketing. The use of SEO, I think, is limited. Maybe there's good reason for that. There's not really much use of PPC at all. but yeah, discoverability is still an issue. I don't think that anyone knows how to solve yet, and it's going to get worse as APIs keep increasing, the number of APIs that keep increasing, then how to discover the API that you want to use easily will be more difficult. There is a new apis.io, apis.io, which is like a search engine of APIs. But for that, you need to have like a robots.txt in your homepage or in your index page. And from that, your API is able to be indexed. So eventually there is the hope. But again, it's a bit like the developer numbers. That was launched in March, and I think it's still only about 40 or 60 APIs have been registered as part of that search engine so far. One of the really encouraging things I've seen though lately as well is there has been a move towards naming APIs, all APIs from our business, though eventually they're going to be used by external developers. So you see much more where the naming conventions of those APIs is something that an end customer or an end developer customer can understand. Like it's not previously I have heard of where they're almost given code names or like Operation Eagle or whatever sort of thing that might be fun internally to a team when they're developing them because they think they're integrating data or services internally. But then when they go to move them to external use, they've got to rewrite all that because no one gets the cultural references that were funny to the internal developer team. So in the same way, but what I'm seeing a little bit more of now is that businesses that are moving into APIs are actually starting with proper names. Like I guess we see that most common with like product catalog or whatever, but it's getting across any part of business, naming those things for external consumption is getting more common. And I think again that shows that whole developer engagement or that readiness of a platform sort of approach. Okay. So that's pretty much it. What we're going to do with this next is we're just confirming those individual data sets. So for each of those numbers, we're checking those over with each of those API businesses analysed. It's been a little bit sensitive, but because we're able to present them all 15 at once, then it'll be much more valuable than just this drip feed of like one API provider feeling that they're exposed with how many developers are actually part of their audience. Originally, we're going to do it as a series of blog posts. So the providers weren't happy with that because they just felt like they were being exposed and no one else was. So we're going to be releasing them all at once, which is point 3. It's going to be an ebook from ProgrammableWeb. Also, we want to just double check some of these findings. One thing that Adam Devander said yesterday, for example, around adoption strategies, he was finding that in his experience, developers are more willing to pay for infrastructure as a service type APIs than they would be for content APIs. That was something that hadn't occurred to me, to be honest. So again, I'd like to look over the findings with industry stakeholders like Adam and some others with many years' experience in the field to be able to confirm and identify some of those missing summary findings as well. And then for you guys, one of the things that I'm really hopeful about this is that we can try to turn it into an interactive tool. So when you're looking for a mapping API, that and you've got some specific ideas that you can put in, okay, a mapping API with this type of revenue share or business model, revenue share or API pay as you go or whatever, with a developer audience, say in the 100 to 150 range or something at the moment, what's the likelihood of generating revenue from using that API? And then out of that, you'll be shown which of these studies might be relevant to read over and have a look at. So the idea is that over time, as we keep building more of these into it, then you'll be able to get faster growth from your end because you'll be able to pick a better API provider for your application or your business needs yourself. So, and then as we do the 15, we're going to keep adding more to that. and then also go back and have a look at the growth of the ones that we have been doing, so that each year, say at APICon, we can do an update on all of these and show you how it's progressing and where have been some of the further success factors for some of the others. So I think that's it. I'd like to give thanks to all of these people for helping with some of the initial research so far and their understanding of where we're going with that. Then if you want to keep in touch, you can. There's my Twitter handle. You can also follow me on ProgrammableWeb, where I talk about business models. And there's my email if you want to have your API business model included in the study in the future.
Brought to you by MuleSoft, provider of the industry-leading Anypoint platform for APIs.